There seems to be a growing awareness right now across science and medicine that women's bodies have been systematically understudied, with female biology like the menstrual cycle or pregnancy being treated as an unwanted variable to be excluded. And psychedelic science is no exception to this. While there may be some reasonable reasons for this, there's also a missed opportunity here to learn from sex-specific insights to better understand how psychedelics could help a diverse range of people. Welcome to the Integration Session podcast. I'm Elena, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley, a neuroscientist with over a decade of experience researching cannabinoids and psychedelics, director of research at the Heroic Hearts Project UK, supporting veterans' mental health, and founder of Hystelica, the world's first organization dedicated to understanding psychedelics through the lens of female biology. We're going to be chatting about how psychedelics interact with things like the menstrual cycle, menopause, and pregnancy, and how this information could help guide safer, more effective use. Let's get into it. Hi, Grace. Thanks so much for being here. I'm super excited to be speaking with you, particularly because of this sort of growing awareness for the importance of research on psychedelics for women and the role of the menstrual cycle and menopause and all of that, which we'll get into. But yeah, I just wanted to start by saying thanks so much for being here.
No, it's lovely to be here, Elena, and I'm really grateful of any opportunity to have the conversation about something that I think is extremely important as we move forward with psychedelic science and bringing psychedelics into fruition.
Yeah, thank you. A friend actually came to me recently and asked about microdosing psilocybin and if that could help with the mood swings that she's experiencing throughout her menstrual cycle in the different phases. And I thought, hold on, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley. Let me just get back to you on that. So we'll get into all of that later. But first, I wanted to talk about your sort of what sparked all of this. So you're the founder of Hystelica. Obviously, you have an interest in psychedelics and a background in the field. But what initially drew you to the field of psychedelics and different drugs and how they act on the brain?
Yeah, so I actually started in the world of cannabis, and I did my PhD in the neuropsychopharmacology of cannabis and how cannabis and different cannabinoids act in the brain, both in a negative way, and we were originally looking at how might people develop things like psychotic disorders from using high amounts of cannabis, and were there particular moments of vulnerability in our lives for using these substances. But we sort of went beyond that work and started to realize that not all cannabinoids were acting the same in the brain, and some could be potentially used in a therapeutic way. And I still continue some of that work to this day, looking at things like cannabidiol in an antipsychotic treatment state. But my real interest came from, I guess, just a sort of curiosity about kind of the mind and about how the mind worked and about changes in consciousness and changes in states of consciousness, and really trying to understand how we see changes in our mind that come about from mental illness, things like psychosis, things like PTSD, things like anxiety and depression. And then I really started to get interested about understanding, well, how do we induce these changes from psychoactive substances like cannabis and like psychedelics? So I completed my PhD looking at neurochemical and neurofunctional changes in cannabis. And then from there, got very, very excited when I started to see, well over 10 years ago now, potentially closer to 15, the initial research that was coming out of Imperial College at the time on psychedelics, mostly psilocybin and LSD, and looking at using neuroimaging techniques that were very similar to the techniques that I was using at the time to discover how these substances were acting in the brain and changing the way that our brain functions. And then I guess there was always a kind of curiosity that came from more of my personal life. I was a young student in London, going to parties and enjoying myself and speaking with my friends and speaking about experiences that people around me were having who had taken substances that we now would recognize as, validated in a clinical setting, but at the time were really seen as, entirely illicit. And particularly to me, a young student, I only saw them as, coming under that umbrella of drugs are bad, but I sort of knew in some strange sort of intuitive way, it's strange because they don't feel bad. And when I'm talking to my friends who perhaps are suffering from psychological distress in other parts of their lives, when they are engaging with these substances, they are getting some kind of benefit from it. And, just because something is illegal, if it does a positive thing, does that mean that it is still all bad? And so I started to really go down this particular line of inquiry well before I started my PhD. But by the time I finished my PhD and was doing my postdoc and then moving towards looking at psychedelic science as a researcher, I was fully convinced that there was an absolute grey area on what was good and what was bad.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I also share a background in neuroscience, and I feel like when you have that, you have a certain understanding of how the brain works and how it creates our reality. And then, yeah, real life experiences, interacting with friends, hearing about things that can change that. It sort of like just draws your attention immediately. Like, how can you not be super fascinated in these substances? So, yeah, that definitely makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, I'm a neuroscientist, and understanding how the brain works. I mean, we really are very much at the beginning, of understanding how the brain works, and that's why I wanted to become a neuroscientist, because I felt like it was the place where there was the most opportunity for expansion of our knowledge, because we were so at the beginning of understanding that. And once you add in things like psychedelic substances and you start looking at the effects that they have, on a molecular level, on a functional level, on a psychological level, there's just so many questions that as a good scientist, you just are desperate to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, totally. And we'll talk about that. I know you had a big interest in female-centered psychedelic research, but I'd like to start with a bit about your connection to veterans' health first. So that's also a really important topic that's been receiving a lot of attention in the psychedelic field. So could you explain your tie to the veterans side of psychedelics and also what you're doing with the Heroic Hearts Project?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my, forever exploratory state, having finished my PhD, I decided that I wanted to explore perhaps the sort of boundaries of what I was capable of. And I actually went and joined the British Army as a reserve infantry officer. And I did that for a number of reasons, but part of that process for me was extremely eye-opening, because I really was able to kind of see and feel and hear what it was like to be part of a military fighting force. Obviously, I was serving alongside a lot of people who had been part of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the previous years, and I had a lot of friends as well who were serving at the time. So I was really able to get myself fully embedded in what it meant to be in the military, and understanding, it's not just about the idea of having sort of traumatic experiences happen to you in the military, but there's so much around the purpose and the culture that when people are in the military and they come out and they become veterans, that can play into components of their psychological health and well-being. So I was really very passionate about how we can best serve people who have served us so well in their time when they were in the military. And so I was able to take a role, over 5 years ago now, as the research director for Heroic Hearts Project. And for those of you who don't know Heroic Hearts Project, they are an incredible organisation. They were founded in 2017 by Jesse Gold in the US, and we now have organisations here in the UK, also in Canada and in Australia. And the primary purpose for the charity is to facilitate military veterans to go through psychedelic programs. And those are, we don't require people to have a diagnosis of PTSD, but they are largely focused for people who are suffering with some kind of psychological issues as a result of being in the military, but actually saying that, I now realise, that kind of isn't always the case. I think quite often veterans suffer because they are no longer in the military, because they are away from this sense of purpose, this sense of family, and quite often it can be related to things, as we know, with many mental health disorders that have happened in their childhood. So what we try and do with Heroic Hearts is to excuse me. What we try and do with Heroic Hearts is we provide a well-structured program that involves sort of very, very careful screening to ensure that everyone we take through those programs is really well suited to do so. And then we provide a very comprehensive coaching program that involves preparation and integration that wraps around a week-long residential retreat. Majoritively, it's been ayahuasca retreats down in Peru with an indigenous tribe that we work with there, but we also do psilocybin retreats in the US itself, in Jamaica, in the Netherlands. And my role has been to try and capture the value of those retreats, looking at how we can see on, validated scales that we might see used in clinical trials, if there are improvements in scales like those we might use for measuring post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, but also going a little beyond that and looking at things like, are we able to see a difference in how military veterans see their conversion from a military personnel to civilian, having gone through these retreats? How well are they then able to assimilate back into their communities? And then we've just got to the end of a huge data collection that we've done recently that has been much more qualitative. So instead of asking, on the PCL-5 scale, how did you score? We're asking veterans, how did you feel? What led you to make the decision to want to come and find this kind of medicine? How did it feel when you had to integrate this back into your lives when you came back? And we hope that all of this work that we're doing and all this research that we're doing is going to provide a kind of comprehensive picture of not only the safety of doing these things, but the potential efficacy of doing them, but also can act as a signal to other veterans who might be interested, so we can understand what does that process really look and feel like for military veterans.
That's incredible. Not only are you sort of connecting veterans with something that's potentially really therapeutic and beneficial, but also doing the research to help inform the field, and obviously that has implications for policy as well. I think that's really incredible what you guys are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a big part of our work as well. It's not directly where I sit within Heroic Hearts Project, but many others within the organisation have really been at the forefront of speaking, particularly in the US, with legislators to try and get them to understand what these substances do, how powerful they can be, and how important it is that we look again at what are quite rigid rules around their use so that we can get access for veterans who really, really need it. I mean, if we look at the statistics in terms of things like suicide rates in military veterans in the US, they are staggeringly high, and they are particularly high when we look at veterans who came out of those Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And so we need to really think about, if we've asked these people to go and potentially lay down their lives on behalf of us to keep us safe, well, do we now need to think about how we can best protect those people now that they're back home?
Yeah, so important. And what inspired you to found Hystelica? How did that come about?
Yeah, so it feels like quite a leap, right? From standing there in my military kit to then going and founding a non-profit organisation that's focused entirely on women, but it actually isn't. I was one of the few women in my role, and in the UK Army particularly, we are required as females to do the same fitness tests and the same exercises that all the men are, and I really was had no way of escaping the reality that my female body was not the same as the male bodies next to me. And, you know, the weight I was carrying obviously felt very different on my body, and things like my menstrual cycle would interfere hugely with my energy levels and how much I was able to perform on different days. So I was really starting to come to this realization that as a society, we're very good at pretending that women are just little men and not really taking account for the full physiological differences that exist between us. This also coincided with me having some kind of realizations around my own kind of female health and things that were going on within my own menstrual cycle, and starting to have conversations with my other female friends around me who perhaps were struggling with things like fertility or painful periods, and starting to hear stories about people who were using psychedelics and getting really interesting responses in terms of things like their menstrual cycle or how stressed they were feeling at different times of the month. So with all this in my mind, I started to think about how psychedelics and how psychedelics work in our bodies and how they could potentially be interfering or interacting with our fertility or with our menstrual cycle, but also how our menstrual cycle and our female hormones could be interacting with psychedelics and how psychedelics worked. And I went to the literature, and when you look at this from a purely theoretical level, so looking at things like how does a psychedelic work? Well, psychedelics work within the serotonergic system by activating, 5-HT2A receptors. Okay, well, how does estrogen work? Well, estrogen also has a huge increase in serotonergic action. And there are many other synergies that exist between female hormones and psychedelics, to the point that I realized that surely there has to be a significant factor here that is female biology in the context of psychedelics. But when I tried to search that, I found that there really was nothing. And not only was there really nothing that was happening as we were kind of moving forward with psychedelic science that paid any kind of respect to the idea that female biology could be a significant variable, if nothing else, within psychedelic science, but we also hadn't really paid respect to female biology in the majority of all Western medicine to date. And unfortunately, the majority of all drugs that have ever been developed haven't really been developed with any great respect to female biology. The majority of understanding that we have around disorders like PTSD, depression, anxiety is all done in a sort of a lens that is largely male-based. A lot of the animal studies that we've ever used to understand how things work have all been done in male animals. But when we look in the epidemiological studies, when we look out there, we see that women are affected by these disorders at different rates to men. Perhaps the symptomology that they experience is different. And so there's very clearly an entire desert of understanding around women and things like how our hormones affect our mental and physical health, and certainly as we move forward into understanding how psychedelics may be maybe having some kind of interaction with our female biology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I decided I would found it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, certainly it's a huge knowledge gap, and this is going to sound like an obvious question, but I just want to make sure it's really emphasized to our listeners. Why do we really need to understand how psychedelics impact women's biology for like the future use of psychedelics or for like the scientific rigor? Could you just like kind of hammer that home for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because of, some of the reasons I just said, there's very, very clear overlap in mechanism between psychedelics and between female hormones. There is very, very clear disproportion in terms of the conditions that we are currently looking at for the use of psychedelics, things like PTSD, anxiety, depression. And there are very, very clear unmet needs in women's healthcare around things to do with our menstrual cycle, to do with menopause transition, potentially even to do with fertility and how, stress plays a huge part in fertility, where psychedelics could offer really innovative promise. And if we don't take it seriously, not only are we going to, potentially miss out on the innovation, but I believe we're going to see more adverse effects come out in clinical in clinic once we see these substances get licensed and used in clinic, if we do not have an understanding of how to use them in women's bodies. Because there are times in our menstrual cycle, for instance, where the symptoms that we're experiencing are changing, and they are going to potentially be more dangerous or less dangerous, or more effective or less effective at different times of the month. And if we do not have a clear understanding of that, then we are doing women an incredible disservice. I don't understand how we can make them sign the same consent form as men and say that we've given them the same oversight of what's going to happen if we do not have this data to understand how these things could be having some kind of effect within the psychedelic experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And just to give some concrete examples for people and maybe some insight on some of the research that you're doing at Hystelica, what is the evidence for sex differences at this moment in response to psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. And a lot of the reason, sometimes you can go to literature and say, well, we don't really see any differences between the sexes within these clinical trials. Well, a lot of the reason is the majority of women that are in clinical trials are quite specific in terms of the age range. So we're not seeing women who are of an older age and might be in menopause, but more interestingly, they are majoritively on hormonal contraception. So when we take hormonal contraception, essentially what we end up doing is blunting the natural fluctuations of our reproductive hormones. And that means that our brain state is more static. So often if you're just doing a comparison in a clinical trial of, do we see a difference between male and females in this clinical trial? Oh, no, we didn't. Well, could it be because the females were all held in this steady state? Another thing that we might see is that sometimes we don't try and look at females when they are in different hormonal states, and we group them all together just as women. And so we may not see a statistically significant difference between the average means of a male and a female group, but if we were to look at the variability, we would see more of a difference. And we at Hystelica have done a number of systematic reviews and scoping reviews over the years, and we are looking to publish a number of them this year coming. And we certainly see that where studies have looked to define, be they preclinical or clinical models, into a set hormonal state, we see a much more reduced set of variability, and we see that there is a splitting of difference between hormonal states within women. So it's not just as simple as saying, are men and women the same? It's, are women in a certain hormonal state the same as women in another hormonal state? If we look into preclinical data, so animal data, we definitely start to see sex differences occurring there. And like I say, it's not just sex differences in our response to the drug and our response to psychedelics, it's even sex differences in the way that different diseases are being expressed by animals. So we need to kind of account for this on two ends. I believe that there's certainly enough evidence out there that shows now that we have got a difference in males and females in terms of psychedelics, but I don't like to think of it like that. I like to think of it, we have a spectrum of reaction that occurs in women depending on the different hormonal states that they are in. And yeah, I'd be happy to share any more about that. We talk about these things in a lot of the education that we do at Hystelica and on our website and various other places where we have the opportunity to stand up and tell people how important this is.
Yeah, it's great. And from my understanding, you're also interested in the potential of psychedelics for menopausal symptoms. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really, really interesting area of research, and it's one of the areas where we are collecting data at Hystelica at the moment. We have had some surveys out for a few years asking women who've used psychedelics to come and tell us about what happened to their menstrual cycle symptoms and to their menopause symptoms. And we started now to look at that data and see what we have been able to find. And within women who are going through perimenopause and menopause, we have seen women come and tell us that they've seen improvement in symptoms that we probably might quite expect given what we've seen in other clinical trials. So improvements in things like their score around anxiety and around depressive symptoms, but also around things like brain fog, and women saying that they've had some sort of improvements in this regard. When we think about menopause and what menopause really is and what it potentially does, it's a bit of a health hazard, really, for women in some regard, because what happens is estrogen and progesterone, the primary neurosteroid reproductive hormones that exist, they through perimenopause, which can be up to 10 years long. I think it's important that we state that. That's why this time could be so distressing for a lot of women. We see this huge fluctuation in estrogen and progesterone. And as I said to you earlier, estrogen and progesterone have these really significant neurosteroid-like effects in the brain that impact things like serotonin, they impact things like glutamate, like GABA, and so they can really change how we feel and also how we think and our executive function. But they also have very important roles in things like neuroplasticity, in things like neuroinflammation. And so once a woman has gone through perimenopause and into menopause, and unfortunately, ladies, it's that or die, we all have to go through it at some point, which is why I think it's so important that we actually do understand it and do find good treatments for it. But when we have gone through menopause, we have this sort of steady low state of estrogen and progesterone. And so a lot of that neuroprotective effects that we get from estrogen and progesterone are much reduced. And that could be a lot of the drivers behind why we see, for instance, neurodegeneration at much higher rates in women than in men. Now, I think that there could be some very interesting potential for psychedelics there, because we know that psychedelics can act as substances that can help reduce neuroinflammation. We know that psychedelics can help increase things like neuroplasticity. So could it be that psychedelics in sort of late perimenopause, menopausal women could be helping to replace some of that effect without the need for hormone replacement therapy? Now, I think hormone replacement therapy is excellent, and I think that it is, gold standard and should be a kind of number one go-to, but I think we've got to have a lot of tools in the box that we can possibly reach for, and hormone replacement therapy is not for everyone. And so could it be that psychedelics could help to kind of boost the brain in this way, having lost some of those effects through menopause? But the final thing of why I think psychedelics can be extremely powerful at this time for women is slightly stepping out of my box a little and away from being just a neuroscientist, and thinking about what it means to be a woman and a woman transitioning through this period of your life. And it can be a huge change, not just on this biological level, and that in itself is a psychological impact when you're suddenly there going, I used to be able to do this, why can I suddenly not remember people's names, why am I waking up in the middle of the night? But you're also seeing these physiological changes in your body. We know that our body composition can really change. We know that society is potentially viewing us in a different way. There is a huge, and often, people who maybe have had children are growing up, often as women we have really given ourselves to the service of others. And at this point in our lives, we're sort of able to sort of take a pause and kind of say, hang on a minute, who am I? Or where did I go? Or who am I going to be next now that I've, done, the first part of my life, and now I'm moving through this transition where we know that we are no longer going to be able to reproduce. And so there is a huge psychological kind of doorway, in a way, that women walk through. And psychedelics are incredible at helping us to shine light on what that might mean for us, and what that might mean for us to reimagine perhaps who we are going to be in the next stages of our lives. And so, although psychedelics could be really wonderful, perhaps thinking in the sense of microdosing, for instance, to be used by women to potentially boost various things like estrogen and, neuroplasticity, etc. But I think the psychological component, the sort of transient experience of doing large doses of psychedelics, can be equally as valuable for women who are going through a significant life change.
Yeah, I totally agree. And my research area is psychedelics and eating disorders, and that's another illness that primarily affects women, and there are very large societal contributors and determinants to the illness. So yeah, I really appreciate that point of the psychological and sort of societal aspects of menopause. And I'm also thinking about psychedelics and pregnancy, because I don't think I've seen a clinical trial on psychedelics that doesn't require either a negative pregnancy test or active birth control. So what are your perspectives there? Is there any research on psychedelics and pregnancy?
Yeah, great question. And luckily, there are some really interesting groups out there who are looking into this and doing it very much from a community base. And just thinking of Mother of the Mushroom, Michaela de la Maica, who is based over in the US, and her group, who've done a lot of work on that, and Amanda Elmore at the University of South Florida, who also has done some really interesting research. But these have all been observational research where they are kind of asking women out in the community about their experiences. And I always hasten to add caution to that, because we need to have really rigorous clinical science in order to understand what could be sort of gestational implications from using psychedelics whilst pregnant, for instance. I actually wrote a blog about this that is on the Hystelica website, if anyone is really interested in this topic, and exactly where we are in terms of the research. But we don't really have very much to go on. We don't really have very much to go on, even in the sense of how safe it might be to breastfeed after taking a psychedelic. What is the clearance time that we have? And that would be extremely useful to know, particularly as we think about using psychedelics for things like postpartum depression. I know that there are a number of trials that have gone on in that and have gotten some reasonably positive results, but we don't want to be in a situation where we are over safe in saying, okay, well, we can give you this treatment, but you have to stop breastfeeding your child potentially forever, because we know that there are positives that are to be gained from breastfeeding that could be lost, and that could be more detrimental to the infant further down the line. We have seen a few preclinical studies that have gone on, and there is a rat study that was done that looked at psilocybin in pregnant rats, and it was seen that psilocybin did cross the placenta, and that there was therefore an exposure risk to a fetus from a mother taking psilocybin, and we don't know what that looks like. There is incredible, and a lot of it is outlined in this blog. There's incredible anthropological work that has gone on where we've looked at indigenous communities and how they have used psychedelics within pregnancy and also while breastfeeding. But I think it's always important that we contextualize that in the idea that we are living the lives that we're living in, Western societies majoritively, and what we're seeing as the outcomes in those reports may not look the same if we were to do them in women, perhaps, or people who had been exposed to psilocybin in utero in a Western world. Another thing as well is, thinking at, how much goes through the placenta. I often hear the sort of, well, could we microdose through pregnancy? Well, potentially, but if we're microdosing, we have a continuous exposure range, and could a continuous exposure at a very small level potentially be more damaging than, say, somebody doing one large dose of psilocybin, for instance? And there is, of course, the major caveat that is the sort of safety of a pregnancy when anyone is breastfeeding. There are some cultures that very early on in pregnancy will use very large doses of psychedelics almost as a validity check on the pregnancy, because we do know that there are physiological changes that go on within our body when we're under the influence of a very high dose of psychedelics that could be dangerous to a pregnancy. So it's of my opinion that we need much better focused research. We need to allow controlled clinical research to go on that allows us to answer these questions, so we don't have to just rely on community reports that may not be accurate enough for us to get good information. And I think there are good reasons why women might want to take psychedelics whilst pregnant, but until we can be more sure about what the full implications of that might be, I think we have to be extremely cautious, and therefore, in my opinion, it shouldn't be done unless it's an extremely specific case where that there's various different implications involved with why that decision might be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you said, we obviously need more research. A lot of what we've talked about today is, there's interesting things from certain types of data, but ultimately more work is needed, and I appreciate you advocating for that. So thinking about those study designs and maybe the design of psychedelic therapy protocols, what do you think needs to be done, or what needs to be changed, whether it's at the study design level or maybe the data analysis? Like, what are your sort of recommendations to better answer these questions?
Yeah, I mean, to do data analysis, you've got to have the data to start with. That's what I've been finding out. So, one of the things I've really been, founded Hystelica, gosh, a few years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago now, and so we've been going around trying to understand how we can really interrogate this question around women and psychedelics. And the big thing we keep hitting up against is the data just isn't there because the questions just aren't asked. And not only are the questions just not asked, many of the questions kind of don't exist because, like I say, this isn't a failing of psychedelic science. This is a failing of Western medicine, full stop. So there haven't been good tools with which to ask the question, to collect the data. So that's the first place we've got to start. And luckily, we at Hystelica are actually hopefully going to start a project in this next year where we want to develop a tool which will be able to be used by clinicians and researchers, where we can start to collect that data and start to put together the picture around answering, how significant and relevant is it, these specific parts about women and women's biology, so that we can, get the sort of best clinical decisions for the person in front of us who needs a therapeutic treatment. And then we can extrapolate that out to, facilitators and retreats and all the rest of it. So it really starts with, designing the questions to get the data to do the analysis. But I think once we are there and once we do have, people kind of waking up to how important this is, I think we've got to really look at trial design. And we've written a paper about this where we've made recommendations, methodological recommendations to researchers, about what questions they should ask, but also about how trial design could be adapted in order that we could have women that are not on hormonal birth control and still be, very safe around including them in trials. I know obviously there is a huge need for regulators to ensure that we don't have things in clinical trials like people getting pregnant when we don't know the adverse effects of the drug on the baby. But I kind of almost find it insulting sometimes, the idea that women can't be trusted to, not use hormonal contraceptives. And so we need to make it much more easy for people to get ethical approval to include people in their trials using things that are non-hormonal. I also don't think you should be putting women on hormonal contraceptives in order for them to be in your trial, particularly if your trial is on some kind of mental health disorder, because these hormones are going to change the symptomology of the disorder you are directly trying to measure. But also looking at how we can do things like time when we are going to dose women within their menstrual cycle. Now, it's going to be a bit of an admin nightmare. Yes, I get it. But we are developing, tools beyond our belief, right? In the forms of, data collection and data analysis and scheduling and things with AI. So it really is not beyond us, that we should be able to design trials now that look to, say, capture, only dosing women in a very set window of the menstrual cycle. So we can at least reduce variability that we are seeing in the data at the end of it. And then hopefully at some point we will have enough of this beautiful data, said it enough times now, that we can start to do analysis to see, are we seeing real differences in outcome based on all of these factors, like where people are in their menstrual cycle, what their hormonal states are, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so important. Thank you for being so passionate about these topics. And my last question now, just looking forward at Hystelica and any research projects that you're excited about, what do you sort of envision for the organization, or more broadly, the role of nonprofits like Hystelica in advancing psychedelics policy and greater inclusivity in medical research?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that for Hystelica, we've got big dreams of where we would like to go, but we have to start with the fact that we are, as I say, standing in this desert without much around us in terms of what has gone before and standards. So our real hope is that for the next few years, we start to really define a standard around what data should be collected and what should be considered significant and relevant in the context of women and psychedelics. But as I said at the start, I would love to start to really dig down deep on these specific female-specific indications and how we could use psychedelics to treat them, and start to clinical development around those for things like premenstrual disorders, menopause, fertility. But further than that, and one of the roles that I hope that Hystelica really gets to play in the future, and I know, of other nonprofits that are really getting involved in this, is how do we actually deliver psychedelic clinical treatments? I'm talking about licensed medicines, licensed treatments that are going to be available through, various payers around the world. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Let's see. Because if you look at the clinical development programs that are moving forward now, if we look at, Compass Pathways, and their treatment-resistant depression trials, we look at, previously Cybin and their trials, what they have looked to do is to evaluate the question, does this molecule treat this disorder? Now, those of us who've actually been involved in psychedelics and psychedelic use and seen it out there in the wild, or been lucky enough to be with indigenous populations or underground healers in any way, know that it is not about, does this molecule solve this problem? There is a much wider program, and that's one of the things I love so much about Heroic Hearts, is how much effort and attention goes into the development of the program and the coaching around the retreat, in terms of what is good preparation, what is good integration, what questions do we need the answers to, up front, what things are there around, female-specific traumas, for instance, where is it in your menstrual cycle where you're going to be, most valuable for you to take the substance? Where is it in your menstrual cycle that we need to be aware of when you're in your integration process, so that we can consider that in how you're moving through? And I really believe that, Hystelica, with the data that we're trying to collect right now, and other nonprofits, around other, specific groups, will be able to provide comprehensive frameworks and potentially education and sort of facilitative sort of guidelines that will be hopefully prescribed alongside the pharmaceutical company's molecule, because the molecule will get you somewhere, but we know how powerful these substances can be, and what they really require is a full comprehensive package. And I really hope that, we're going to be a big part of making sure that we've got sort of female driven and protocols that are respective of all these other aspects.
Yes, thank you so much, Grace. It's a super important conversation, so I really appreciate you sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for tuning into this conversation with Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley. This is a podcast by the Center for Psychedelics Health and Research at Queen's University, and supported by the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.